She walked on stage with a smile and a song, but behind that glimmering voice was a story no one truly knew. Jeannie Seely, Miss Country Soul, stood proudly beneath the Grand Ole Opry lights for over 5 decades. Yet now, at 90 years old, she's revealing what those lights never showed. The silent battles, the quiet betrayals, the strength it took to wear a miniskirt on a stage that wasn't ready for women like her. For years, she played by the unspoken rules, but not anymore. Jeannie's finally speaking her truth, and it's not always pretty. What she says about the Opry, about country music, and about her own journey is more powerful than any standing ovation, because for the first time in her long, glittering career, Jeannie Seely is finally ready to be heard, and what happens next will change everything. Before the rhinestones, before the spotlight, before the Grand Ole Opry stage, there was Titusville, Pennsylvania. A quiet town tucked away in the northwest corner of the state, known more for oil rigs than country singers. But that's where Jeannie Seely was born, in 1940, into a working-class family that didn't have much, but always had music. Her parents weren't famous. Her house wasn't big, but the dreams inside that little girl were already bursting at the seams. By the time she was 10, Jeannie was performing on local radio, her voice tiny but unmistakable. And even then, she knew something most adults didn't. She belonged on a stage. But dreams don't pay bills. After high school, she took a job at a bank, then moved to California in the early 1960s, chasing sunshine, but more importantly, chasing opportunity. There, she worked as a secretary at Liberty Records, typing up contracts by day and writing songs at night. That's when the stars started aligning. One of her songs, Leavin' and Sayin' Goodbye, found its way into the hands of country great Dottie West. Then came more cuts, more co-writes, more closed doors opening just a crack. But Jeannie didn't just want to be behind the scenes, she wanted to sing her own stories. And then came 1966. That year, she recorded Don't Touch Me, a sultry ballad that didn't just climb the charts, it kicked the door wide open. The song hit number 2 on the Billboard Country chart and won her a Grammy for Best Female Country Vocal Performance. She was only the 3rd woman ever to win that award in country music. Overnight, Jeannie Seely went from that girl who writes songs to that woman everyone's talking about. But success came with a price. Backstage in Nashville, some welcomed her. Others looked her up and down and saw an outsider. She didn't come from a Southern dynasty. She didn't wear pearls or play sweet. She had a spark in her eye, a swagger in her voice, and a mind of her own. Still, the Opry noticed, and in 1967, they extended her the most coveted invitation in country music, a place in the Grand Ole Opry cast. For Jeannie, it felt like a dream coming true, but she had no idea what it would cost her, because the very things that made her special would also make her controversial. She wasn't the kind of woman they were used to, and the first time she stepped onto the Opry stage, her voice wasn't the only thing that made headlines. Her skirt did. The Grand Ole Opry stage had seen legends walk its polished floorboards, but in 1967, when Jeannie Seely made her official debut as a member, she did something no woman had dared before. She wore a miniskirt. The skirt itself wasn't extravagant. It wasn't even flashy by Hollywood standards. But on the Opry stage, where women still wore long gowns and heels, and where tradition hung heavy in the air, it was as if someone had dropped a firecracker in the front row. Gasps rippled through the audience. Some clapped, some frowned. And backstage, the whispers were instant. That's not how a lady dresses. She'll never last here. But Jeannie didn't flinch. She wasn't trying to make a statement. She was just being Jeannie, confident, modern, and unapologetic. The same woman who'd fought her way out of a small town, who'd worked as a secretary while writing award-winning songs, who'd earned her place with a Grammy-winning voice. She wasn't about to shrink to make others comfortable. Still, the moment marked her. In interviews years later, Jeannie would laugh about it, calling it just a skirt. But she also admitted what it cost her. While the Opry never publicly criticized her, the tension behind the scenes grew. She wasn't the kind of performer they were used to. or entirely comfortable with. The Opry in the late 60s still clung to its old guard mentality. Female performers were often expected to sing pretty songs, smile politely, and disappear into the background. But Jeannie didn't fit that mold. She cracked jokes. She spoke her mind. She dressed how she wanted. She sang songs that weren't always sweet, and the establishment didn't always like it. She began noticing little things. The best performance slots going to male artists. Her name left out of certain press releases. Cold shoulders backstage. But Jeannie didn't bow out. She dug in. Because if the industry wouldn't be end to her, she'd bend the rules until they broke. And slowly, they did. She became a staple at the Opry, earning standing ovations and fan devotion. But that early scandal left a permanent impression. To some, she'd always be that girl with the miniskirt. No matter how many records she sold, no matter how many stages she lit up. And while male artists were celebrated for their boldness, Jeannie was often seen as difficult, pushy, or unladylike. But she wasn't trying to start a fight. She was trying to survive in a system that wasn't built for women like her. Jeannie Seely didn't just challenge the Opry's dress code, she challenged its unspoken rules about how women should behave, speak, and perform. And that act of quiet rebellion became a turning point, not just in her career, but in country music itself. But the real battles? They weren't about clothes. They were about respect. And behind the velvet curtains of the Opry, Jeannie saw just how much of that was reserved for others. To the outside world, the Grand Ole Opry was a dreamland, a living museum of music legends, Southern charm, and Nashville tradition. People traveled thousands of miles just to catch a glimpse of its famed stage. For fans, it was sacred. But for Jeannie Seely, it was something else entirely. Behind the iconic barn doors and glowing circle of wood from the Ryman stage was a backstage filled with silence, hierarchy, and unspoken tension. The Opry may have looked like family from the seats, but from the dressing rooms, it often felt like a cold war. Jeannie saw the divide early on. There were favorites, untouchables, artists who got the primetime slots, the media attention, the red carpet treatment. Then there were the rest, those who quietly kept the show alive, but were rarely mentioned in press releases or history books. And women? They were almost always in the second category. Some were allowed one song per night. Some were expected to freshen up the show, not headline it. Jeannie watched talented female artists be passed over for younger, more photogenic newcomers, or politely nudged aside to make room for male headliners. She never called it out publicly. Not back then. She couldn't afford to. Speaking too loud might mean fewer invitations, fewer radio plays, fewer shows, and Jeannie was already walking a tightrope as a woman with opinions in a man's game. So, she kept showing up, kept smiling, but she was watching, remembering. She noticed how the Opry celebrated its male veterans, revered them as legends, protected their legacies, booked them regularly. But women were rarely afforded the same dignity. They'd disappear, often without notice. Jeannie knew their names, knew their stories, and quietly vowed to never let herself become one of them. And yet, as the years rolled on, the same pattern repeated. Younger artists were brought in with fanfare, while older performers, especially women, were slowly pushed out of the spotlight. It wasn't done cruelly, it was done quietly. Jeannie called it the slow fade. You didn't get fired, you just stopped getting calls. And even as she stood among the legends, she sometimes felt like she was fading too. In the 80s and 90s, country music changed. It got glossier, more commercial, and the Opry began shifting with it. Jeannie adapted, singing new material, updating her look. But she wasn't part of the new Nashville machine. She never played the industry games. And so, she was left out of them. But she didn't quit. Jeannie kept performing, week after week, year after year, long after the press had moved on, long after many of her peers had retired or passed away. She kept walking through those backstage halls, smiling politely at the politics she never liked, because the stage still meant something to her, even if it didn't always love her back. And decades later, with wrinkles on her face and steel still in her spine, Jeannie would finally begin to speak openly about what she saw behind those curtains, not with bitterness, but with truth. Because after a lifetime of surviving the Opry's silence, she'd earned the right to tell her story. Country music has always been about heartbreak, but for Jeannie Seely, the heartbreak wasn't just on stage. It was real, raw, and often waiting for her the moment the curtains closed. In 1969, Jeannie married legendary songwriter Hank Cochran. To the outside world, they were a country music power couple, two creatives with Grammys, hits, and history between them. But behind the scenes, it was turbulent. Hank was brilliant, but troubled. The marriage was filled with passion, but also pressure, long nights, high expectations, and two artists struggling to hold their own identities while tangled in one another's shadows. Jeannie didn't talk about it much. She rarely aired her personal struggles in public, but years later, she admitted the truth. Love, even when real, can still hurt, and the pain doesn't always end when the relationship does. Their marriage eventually fell apart, and Jeannie was left picking up the pieces, not just emotionally, but professionally. After the divorce, she didn't fall apart. She threw herself deeper into the music, touring, recording, writing, performing, anything to keep from sinking. But when the applause faded, the loneliness crept in. The industry moved on quickly. One moment, you're the rising star. The next, you're a familiar name, but no longer the one getting calls from radio stations or major labels. For women, especially, the descent from relevance could be sharp and cold, and Jeannie felt it. She watched her peers, Dottie West, Patsy Cline, Loretta Lynn, each facing their own versions of personal struggle and industry distance. Some were taken too soon, some faded quietly, some battled demons no one saw. And Jeannie? She endured. There were years when the spotlight dimmed, years when the Opry barely called, years when she'd walk through backstage corridors and feel like a ghost of the woman who once shocked them in a miniskirt. But she kept showing up because the music was never the problem. The silence was. Offstage, her personal life became quieter too. Friends passed away. Romantic partners came and went. She lived alone. And while she never begged for sympathy, there was a heaviness she couldn't hide completely. In interviews, she hinted at it. In her songs, she revealed it. "I've sung about every kind of heartache you can think of," she once said. "But the hardest kind is the one you don't have words for." Still, she never lost her fire. Even as she aged, she refused to be pitied. She wore her independence like a badge, and slowly, that resilience became her second legacy. Not just as a singer, but as a survivor. A woman who didn't need to marry a producer, reinvent herself for the charts, or fade gracefully into the shadows. She stayed, even when the doors stopped swinging open, even when the phones stopped ringing, even when no one said thank you. Because for Jeannie, country music was more than a career. It was her lifeline. But that didn't mean she wasn't fighting a private war to stay visible. And in the next chapter of her life, that battle would come to the surface, whether Nashville was ready or not. By the time Jeannie Seely entered her 50s, most artists in country music had already taken their final bows. Retirement, obscurity, or quiet cameos were the expected end. But Jeannie had no intention of fading into the past. If anything, she was just getting started. What the industry failed to see, again and again, was that Jeannie didn't just survive on talent. She survived on grit, quietly. Behind the curtains of fame, she was still writing, still recording, still pouring her soul into every lyric, even if no major label was asking for them. She also became something few artists her age dared to become, an advocate. Jeannie began speaking, carefully at first, about the way older performers, especially women, were treated. How the Opry had become a revolving door for fresh faces, while veterans were quietly benched. She noticed how men were celebrated for aging gracefully, while women were expected to stay forever 29 or disappear entirely. And she didn't stay silent about it. But Jeannie didn't march or protest. She used the most powerful tool she had, her presence. She kept showing up, not once a year for an anniversary show, not just for milestone appearances, every week. Jeannie took the stage at the Opry, dressed in rhinestones, ready to sing like it was her first night. And the audience? They noticed. The standing ovations returned. Younger fans, unfamiliar with her early hits, saw something deeper, a woman who hadn't given up, a living piece of country history, still writing new chapters. Still, the institution around her was slow to change. It took decades for the Opry to acknowledge what Jeannie had become, the longest-tenured female member in its history. A record that came not from constant media buzz or high-charting singles, but from sheer consistency, from stubborn, beautiful resilience. But behind those victories were battles no one saw. There were health scares, hospital visits, moments she didn't know if she'd walk back onto that stage, times when the energy wasn't there, but she pushed through anyway. Not because she had to, but because something inside her refused to let go. And then there were the emotional scars. She watched friends disappear from the lineup. She watched promises get made and broken. At times, she felt like she was performing not just for applause, but to remind the Opry she was still here, still worth remembering, still a name that mattered. But for all the silence she endured, Jeannie never lost her voice. She started producing her own records. She began collaborating with younger artists who respected her legacy and didn't treat her like a relic. She found a new audience, not just country fans, but women across generations who saw in her a version of themselves. Strong, older, unapologetic, real, and perhaps, most profoundly, she began opening up in interviews, sharing the truths she once kept hidden about ageism, about erasure, about being seen as difficult for simply asking to be treated equally. It wasn't bitter, it was clarity, the kind that comes only after a lifetime of standing your ground. And through it all, Jeannie proved something powerful. Success doesn't always come fast, and sometimes the second chapter is where the real story begins. The Grand Ole Opry that Jeannie Seely walks into today doesn't look or sound like the one she joined in 1967. The stage is still there, the lights still warm, but the voices echoing through the pews are younger, louder, and more diverse than ever before. To some, it's progress. To others, it's a loss of tradition. But to Jeannie, it's complicated. She watched it all unfold from the inside, how the industry shifted from dusty vinyls and AM radio to digital streams and TikTok hits. She watched young artists rise faster than ever before, and sometimes vanish just as quickly. And she wondered quietly if the country music she gave her life to was being rewritten without footnotes. When the Opry began inducting newer, more pop-influenced acts, some veterans bristled, but Jeannie didn't. She didn't see change as a threat, she saw it as necessary. What did bother her, though, was how easily the past was being erased. She noticed how younger artists weren't always taught the names of those who paved the way, how some producers viewed age as a liability, how some fans assumed anything older than 30 was outdated. She called it musical amnesia, a forgetting of roots that country music, more than any other genre, was supposed to honor. Still, she stayed gracious. She cheered on artists like Casey Musgraves, Mickey Guyton, Carly Pearce, women who, in their own ways, were challenging the country's norms just as Jeannie once had. She saw herself in them, their courage, their sharp edges, their refusal to be boxed in. But she also saw how much hadn't changed. Radio still skewed male, festivals still booked men 3-to-1, and the Opry, for all its evolution, still rarely gave older women the spotlight they deserved. Jeannie was celebrated, yes, but only because she refused to disappear. What about the others who didn't have her stamina, her fire? There's an old saying in Nashville, they love you until they don't. Jeannie lived that reality, but instead of letting it harden her, she used it as fuel. In interviews, she became more candid. She spoke about how the Opry had ignored women for decades, how female members were rarely asked to host, how, even today, they often had to fight twice as hard for half the recognition. But there was no bitterness in her voice, only truth. And slowly, the Opry began to listen. Jeannie became a bridge between generations. She invited new artists on stage. She mentored them. She shared dressing rooms with 22-year-olds and 82-year-olds, reminding everyone that country music isn't about age. It's about honesty, soul, storytelling, and her presence alone became a quiet revolution. Because there, in the wings of a changing industry, stood a woman who had seen it all, who had lived through the eras of rhinestones, radio silence, rejection, and revival, and who never once gave up her seat at the table, even when they tried to take it away. The Opry is still changing, still finding its balance between past and present. But every time Jeannie Seely steps onto that stage, she reminds the world, tradition isn't about staying the same. It's about remembering where you came from, even as you move forward. At 90 years old, Jeannie Seely doesn't ask for permission anymore. She walks onto the Grand Ole Opry stage with silver in her hair, wisdom in her eyes, and a fire in her voice. The girl from Titusville is long gone. What remains is a woman who has outlasted eras, outlived most of her peers, and outshined expectations every step of the way. She no longer wears the miniskirt that sparked scandal in the 60s, but not because she regrets it. She just doesn't need the shock factor anymore. Her presence alone commands respect. Every wrinkle tells a story. Every line in her voice carries the weight of decades. In recent years, Jeannie has opened up in ways she never dared before. She's spoken about the wounds that never healed, the sexism, the ageism, the times she was overlooked and underestimated, but she shares these stories not to complain, but to teach, to show others that you can speak softly and still shake the walls. Her recent performances aren't just concerts, they're declarations. Jeannie doesn't hide her age, she doesn't try to sound 25. She sings with truth, with history, with soul. And that, she says, is more powerful than any chart position. She's finally being recognized as more than a survivor. She's a cornerstone, a matriarch, a symbol of what it means to endure with grace and grit. And she's done it all without ever truly being the industry's darling. "I didn't get here because I was the easiest choice," she once said. "I got here because I didn't leave." At 90, she's not slowing down. She's just telling the truth, finally, fully, and without apology. Jeannie Seely was never meant to fade into the background. For over 6 decades, she stood where legends stood, sometimes praised, sometimes ignored, but always standing. Through heartbreak, rejection, reinvention, and revival, she held on. Not for fame, not for applause, but because music was who she was. And even when the world turned its back, she refused to step off stage. The country music industry has a way of forgetting, but Jeannie forced it to remember her. Through sheer presence, week after week, year after year, she didn't chase trends, she didn't beg for relevance, she simply endured. And in doing so, she made herself impossible to erase. What she represents now is more than music. She is proof that aging is not defeat, that a woman can get older, speak louder, and still matter, still inspire, still command the room without shrinking to fit it. Her story is not just about country music, it's about persistence, about dignity, about never letting others define your worth. At 90, she has nothing left to prove and everything left to say. She once broke barriers with a miniskirt. Now she breaks silence with her truth. And through it all, one thing remains crystal clear. Jeannie Seely didn't just survive the Grand Ole Opry, she became part of its soul.